Now, a quick check of the calendar reveals that this is obviously the eve of the 60th anniversary of the Brown decision. And the nation's largest dropout prevention organization has released a report detailing the state of education in America. Joining us now to talk about that report, President of Communities in Schools, or as it's known by its abbreviation CIS, Dan Cardinali. Dan, we thank you for your time and we welcome you to America's Forum.
Thank you, JD. It's a delight to be with you all today.
Dan, obviously, this case, we went over the historical context. The end of separate but equal. I can recall later further decisions that led to busing to end de facto segregation. I went through that firsthand in the American South, growing up in North Carolina. But I understand your new report comes out now, and it talks about continued inequality in education. Do you want to give us an overview of what your organization found?
Sure. So JD, Communities in Schools is in 26 states in the District of Columbia, and we work with about 1.2 million students across some of the nation's most challenged communities. And what we're finding is that the good news in America is that we hit an 80% graduation rate. That was announced a couple of weeks ago, the Department of Education. But if you look into the data, you see that we still have some work in front of us. And part of that work is that young people who are going to school are facing a set of challenges, often imposed by poverty. They're hungry, they're in need of food and shelter. They have a set of challenges as simple as needing eyeglasses that can be really fundamental barriers to their learning. So we know that while we've made progress in terms of graduation rates, we see that poverty is still a relatively important factor in predicting student outcomes. And unfortunately, poverty is not equally distributed, and so there's a lack of will in American public to kind of wrestle with it. And we see that in terms of this inequality, school systems that are predominantly brown and black, Latino and African American kids are disproportionately poor. So we see real challenges there in those school systems.
Well, Dan, you mentioned one of the areas in which your organization works is the District of Columbia. And in fact, despite home rule, education in the District of Columbia, Congress is directly accountable for what transpires in the district. As I understand it, a new study indicates that per student in the District of Columbia in public schools, over $29,000 is spent per student. However, the study of 8th graders indicates that 83% of those 8th graders lack a proficiency in reading, 81% lack a proficiency in math. Now, in terms of money being spent, $29,000 per pupil is not chump change. What is the difficulty there in the District of Columbia?
So the District of Columbia has a high percentage of young people who are living in economically challenged situations. And so the resources that the district is allocating are going to really funding terrific facilities and highly qualified teachers. But a number of those young people, many of those young people are showing up to school with a set of barriers that schools, many of whom are not prepared to wrestle with. So when you show up hungry and a kid puts his or her head on their desk, they're unavailable to the best qualified teacher, no matter what kinds of resources. So what I'm happy to say is the District of Columbia is beginning to partner very systematically with communities and schools to bring into the school a set of resources, access to the food banks and to nonprofits that provide eyeglasses to help kids see. It's a little known fact, but about 25% of American students have sight impairment problems. And poor children routinely go undetected in these sight problems. They become fundamental barriers. So the goal here is to leverage those resources that are being allocated in the District of Columbia by ensuring that community resources are partnered with them to ensure all young people have a shot at taking full advantage of public education.
So Dan, we're obviously dealing here with some socioeconomic issues, but I wonder if there's anything here that shows that there is some signs that there's good news here and that things are getting better in some of these communities that have been so hardly hit, things like charter schools. Do you find that that's bringing some success to areas that have struggled from lack of resources in the past?
It's a great question. So what we're seeing across the country is that in general, charters map pretty much to the way public education, traditional public education does. Some are quite high performing, some are about the same, and some are lower performing. And so what you actually see when you dig into the data with charter schools is those charter schools that belong to networks, much like school systems, tend to do much better. Things like Idea Charter School out of Texas, a very strong partner of communities and schools, and we hold them in high regard. They have a very large network, and they have figured out how to maximize their resources, provide really high quality professional development and support to teachers. And you see them doing quite well. One-off charter schools tend not to do much better than the mainstream public school system.
Well, you obviously are using the occasion of the 60th anniversary of Brown versus the Board to talk about the current state of American education and the concerns you have. You also, your organization has put together a public service announcement. Let's take a listen to this together right now, shall we?
It got worse and worse and worse throughout the years. I mean, it was just rough focusing on school when your mother, who acts like a child, is somebody you have to take care of.
I appeared to be doing good at my school life, but if you would see me at home, it would have been a completely different story.
There are students who need somebody.
Well, Dan, as we see this, it evokes memories of a debate that continues to this day in Congress. When I was there, serving on the Ways and Means Committee, there was a real yearning to put together, I guess they were calling it a fatherhood initiative. I know President Obama has worked in that area a great deal, but as I hear your PSA, I'm struck by the fact that a lot of this sounds to me like what we would call family issues. So how difficult is it to come in as a third party, even with the most caring volunteers, into a family dynamic that faces such concerns?
It's a great question, JD. We get this a lot. So let me say, I've been doing this work for over 20 years and at communities and schools for 15. And I've never met a parent in all my years of working across the country that isn't deeply committed to their children. What I do find is that parents who are in economically distressed situations have an enormous set of barriers they themselves are wrestling against. I know many parents who work 2, sometimes 3 jobs. And so an organization like ours that has professional staff that is trained to partner with parents, even in the most dire circumstances, and leverage other community resources to support parents and their children, have a very powerful effect. So at the beginning, I mentioned that we work with about 1.2 million students across the U.S. We also partner with about 250,000 parents or guardians because we see parents and families as critical supports for young people's success.
Well, I think we can all agree on that. And we can also, I believe, Dan, it is not necessarily socioeconomic status that is a barometer of parental involvement. Indeed, in several prosperous suburban schools, there is a feeling when you engage in casual conversation and perhaps anecdotal experience that sometimes parents, regardless of their economic status, look at school as, well, a babysitting service. So attitudes have to change across the board. About 30 seconds for your last word. 60th anniversary. Has racism by and large been abolished and it comes down to a matter of economic status now? Your take on the current situation.
So I think if you look at the data, then it confronts some brutal facts about America. The good news is we've been able to muster political will, big P and little p, to improve graduation rates across America. If you look at the recent release of the National Assessment on Educational Progress, you see that we actually haven't closed the achievement gap. So while we know what to do to improve public education, we still have a long way to go.
More work to be done. We'll leave it there. Dan Cardinali of CIS, we appreciate your input, your perspective as we approach the 60th anniversary of Brown versus the Board of Education. Your thoughts on education and the situation of equality, tweet us at Newsmax TV.